Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Chantel and today I'm going to be doing a tag. I just feel like now is a good time to do a tag. I haven't done one in a little while except for the mid-year freakout tag, which I do every year anyway, and is mostly just a check-in of sorts rather than like an actual kind of chatty discussion tag. So I thought I would do a tag. Today I'm going to be doing the reading shifts tag, which is a tag that was created by Hannah at Hannah's Books. I really like her channel a lot. I will most likely link her channel in the description below for you to check out. She is always very thoughtful and has many interesting things to say. And yeah, I want to do this tag because this tag is a very thoughtful kind of tag with lots of really sort of introspective kinds of questions that sort of really get me thinking about and examining my own tastes and my own reading habits and how they may have changed, or maybe how they do change over time. And I think that's a really interesting point of discussion. So let's get into the tag, shall we? The first prompt in this tag is, how has your reading developed over your lifetime? Do the kind of books that bring you the most pleasure now differ from the books you loved most earlier in your life? If you've seen big changes in your reading since you've matured, what might explain your changing interests? I think this is a really interesting question, especially as someone who has been reading for pretty much my entire life. I think this is really, it's really interesting to sort of try and think about, okay, what are the things that I was into when I was younger versus what I'm into now? What are the similarities and differences there? Because that's the thing, right? Is that like there are definitely a number of similarities. There are definitely a number of books that I would say are still favorites of mine, that have been favorites of mine since I was a kid. But there are also ways in which my reading habits and tastes have changed and shifted over time. I think probably the biggest and most obvious one to me is how much more mystery and thriller books I used to read when I was a teenager, especially, versus now, where I'll read a mystery book now and then. I like a murder mystery. I like a hard-boiled mystery sometimes, but I really don't read much thriller anymore. And when I do dip my toes into it, I tend not to have a very good time anymore with it. And I do think that's interesting. In a lot of ways, I've expanded my reading taste a lot more since I was like 13, 14, 15 years old. I do read, in a lot more genres and a lot of different genres, and across different styles and time periods for pleasure than I did back then. But yeah, that is one thing that has kind of dropped off over time, is my interest in thrillers, especially in like contemporary, like crime novels, is really sort of dropped off. And I'm not entirely sure how to explain it, except that perhaps as I've grown older, I think my interest has shifted away from plot and plot twists. I think in a lot of ways I am much more interested in a good character arc now than I was when I was like 14 or 15 years old. I have always enjoyed a good character, but I do think that I am much more inclined now as an adult to want to read a slower paced, more character driven kind of novel than I was when I was a teenager. When I was a teenager, I was rather avariciously devouring these really sort of snappy, fast-paced, like crime mystery novels where the main character, I read a lot of these series where it's like they all have the same main character, and the main character's like a cop or a private detective or something, and then, and is always like trying to solve these crimes. And the character may change over time, but you didn't have to read them in any particular order necessarily either, right? Because each one is a self-contained story, and it's just very much about, someone trying to find the truth, and there's a plot twist, and then a red herring, and then there, somebody else is in danger, or maybe our main character it gets put in danger, and, and then things just move at a very quick pace until you get to the end when everything is sort of resolved, and the main character maybe has some trauma or something that they're going to carry with them into the next books in the series, but very sort of heavily focused on just sort of a case of the week kind of formulaic situation. And there's nothing wrong with those books, right? For instance, I read a hell of a lot of Mary Higgins Clark when I was a teenager, right? These may not necessarily all be in series, but they would be similar, very similar kinds of stories, right? Nothing wrong with that at all, not at all, if that's what you're into. And I read a lot of them myself. I don't read as many of them now, just because, I guess, I think that's really my explanation for it. And also, I have just gotten away from, I don't really care that much about a contemporary setting anymore. I'll occasionally read a book that's set just sort of, in our contemporary period, that's just sort of, it's not a period piece, it's not a secondary world, fantasy or sci-fi or whatever. I will occasionally do that, but it's not really something that I seek out as often anymore. I think there's a point at which I got sucked into the secondary world fantasy, and I'm just really here for a world that's not mine, right? I'm really here for, and not in an escapist way necessarily, but just because I'm interested in it, right? I'm interested in how writers build a world, right? Even if it's a historical fiction, right? A very realistic historical fiction, I'm interested in how writers created the atmosphere of a historical time and place that is not mine, right? That's what I'm really, really interested in as well. So characters and sort of world building and the structure of how an author builds out a world that is different from my own has led me away from the sort of contemporary crime thriller genre in a pretty profound way. But yeah, so I suppose that's one thing, right? But of course, I have always been interested in the fairy tales, the fantasies, the historical fiction of it all. That's always been a bedrock of my reading. I think it's just become more and more prominent as I got older, as I read more classics, as I read more fantasy and sci-fi. That has always been sort of the bedrock, but now it's like a lot of what I read now is that stuff, But I do think I have expanded my horizons a lot as well as I get older, right? Again, I read a lot more classic literary fiction than I used to do when I was a kid. The only classic literary fiction I read as a kid was basically the stuff that I had to read for school. I read now some of that stuff for pleasure. And I read a lot more nonfiction for pleasure now than I used to. I read even poetry sometimes for pleasure. When I was a teenager, I would have completely balked at the idea of reading poetry for fun. But I do occasionally read poetry for fun. And I do like more sort of literary genre fiction, right? I appreciate a way with words. I appreciate someone who is really good with structure and narrative and drawing out character arcs, and who has a great style in their writing. That's always been a big thing for me. So yeah, that's that's my very sort of long-winded and rambly response to the first prompt of this tag. Prompt number 2. Do you find yourself choosing different kinds of books at different periods of the year? For example, do the seasons affect what you read for pleasure? Similarly, might you read very different kinds of books while on vacation? I guess yes and no. I'm not I would say I'm not heavily influenced by the seasons. I know there are some people who like in the wintertime we read wintertime books, and in the summer we read summertime books, and that's like they're very strict about it, and their mood is very dictated by that. I'm not so much. I just finished reading the Winter Night trilogy in the middle of summer. It's very much a wintry kind of Northern European influenced story that, you know, many people would probably say is definitely like a wintertime read. I read it in the middle of summer. It was fine. I had no problem with that, right? And, you know, I'll read a good horror novel just about any time of year. But there are definitely times of year when I am feeling more in the mood for certain kinds of things. So, you know, in the fall, I do like to read cozy stuff in the fall. I also really like to read atmospheric things. Again, I really like an atmospheric novel any time of the year, but if I'm gonna really read, dive into like gothic horror, atmospheric kind of things, I'm gonna do a lot more of that in the autumn, right? Because that feels to me like the time to do that, right? I want to read a creepy haunted house book in the autumn. I'll read one any time of the year, but especially in the autumn, I'm feeling that. In terms of like vacation and traveling, I think that definitely does affect my reading, because when I'm on vacation, I'm often, I'm the kind of person who I like to go to a place and like do a lot of touristy things. I like to take tours, I like to do activities, I like to be involved, and I like to see the sights and learn about the place that I'm in, and do all of the stuff that you would think of when you think of, you know, traveling and being a tourist. When I take a vacation like that, I tend to take books with me that I'm going to be having a really easy time with, that I'm going to be able to dip in and out of quite easily, that doesn't require much brain power on my part. That's a time when I'm going to be more likely to maybe read like a lighthearted, cozy fantasy, or a really light sort of historical romance novel or something. Something that I can just dip in and out of easily, because I'm going to be doing stuff all day, and then I get back to my hotel room and I'm tired, and I'm not going to have a lot of extra brain power to read something that's going to be really dense or difficult. And so I'm just going to be wanting to spend 20 minutes reading a chapter or two of something that I can dip in and out of and then leave it to the side again. There are times I do occasionally take the more like the kind of vacation where you just kind of sit in a cabin or at a lake or on a beach and just kind of sit and enjoy and just relax and, you know, be somewhere else for a bit. I do that sometimes too, and I'm more likely to bring a longer, more complicated book with me on that kind of vacation, where I'm just going to be sitting by a fire and enjoying the atmosphere, or sitting at a lakeside resort or something like that and just reading a book. So I'll do that too. So yeah, the vacation thing definitely, I think, affects what kinds of books I read. The seasons somewhat, but not a whole lot. The third prompt is, do specific experiences in your life ever shape what you choose to read? For example, did you read obsessively about child rearing when your kids were little, about gardening as spring is about to begin, about the experience of grief when someone you loved died, etc.? I would say for me, there is not a super direct line between specific life experiences and specific choices of reading material. However, that doesn't mean there isn't a connection. I think the connection tends to arise much more organically. I'm not the kind of person who, I don't have kids, but for instance, when my nephew was born, I have done a little bit of reading and research. I'm pretty involved in my nephew's life. My sister and I are close. We're a close-knit family. We live close together. I see them like at least once a week usually. We're pretty heavily involved in each other's lives. And like I did do a little bit of reading here and there about like child rearing, but really what has happened since my nephew has been born, since he's been in my life, is that I just read more with a view towards, is this something he might like, right? Like I just take him into consideration and into my thoughts more, in a way that I never really expected would happen. This is not something that I planned, but it's just sort of like I'll be reading a book and it'll just come into my head that like, I bet Henry would like this. Like I should give this to my sister because she should read it to my nephew and I bet he would enjoy this story. Or it'll be something like, if there's a child character in a book that I'm reading, I will compare that child to my nephew, in ways that I just never would have expected. Similarly with the grief thing, my dad died a couple years ago, and again, I don't seek out like nonfiction books about grieving or dealing with grief or loss. I don't do that. I'm not really that kind of person. It's just that there are books that I read that just make me think of him. And there are books that I read where maybe a character is experiencing a loss that affect me more profoundly or more deeply than they probably would have before my dad died, right? So, and it does just kind of, it just sort of changes your perspective, these big life events, right? That for me is what it does, right? It just sort of changes your perspective. It alters the way you see the world, and in that way it alters the way that I see the way that my reading affects me in some ways, right? It makes me think different things than I otherwise would have if I was still like 18 years old and, I didn't have my nephew is not even a twinkle in my sister's eye and my dad was still alive. I'm just like, I'm a very different person, and so I approach my reading in a different way, and they make me think of different things in different perspectives than what I would have done before I'd experienced these big life events. I think that's really what it is for me. So, the fourth prompt is, have there been any times in your life when circumstances have limited or changed your reading in some way? Perhaps caretaking responsibilities or a big move that made it hard to find as much time to read as you'd like, or personal illness that made it harder to concentrate, or maybe just long-term travel that might have limited your book choices, and how do you deal with those circumstances? The only thing I can really think in my life that had affected my reading choices was when I was in grad school, right? When I was involved heavily in academia, when I was in grad school, I was reading a lot because I was in a film program that expected us to read a lot. But I was reading not for pleasure, right? I was reading because it was expected of me, right? It was one of the expectations of my graduate program that I read all of these things. And so I was reading a lot about film and television and video games and new media. And it was, which is not to say that I didn't enjoy it, right? When I say I wasn't reading for pleasure, I don't mean that I wasn't enjoying the things that I was reading. It means that I was having to read these things for a purpose other than simply my own enjoyment, right? And I did not read much for pleasure at all during that time, right? Because there's just no time. You just do not have time. You're expected often to read like 200-page books and 80 pages of essays like per week in grad school, plus all the movies that I had to watch, right? Like I had to watch, like I was in a film studies program. I'm expected to watch and to analyze a lot of movies all the time. And so, like, that, I just did not have the space to just sit down and read a fiction book for pleasure. So I didn't read much at all. And then when I got out of grad school, when I did leave academia and I came back home and I got a regular job and I started just doing regular things and I had leisure time again, it still took me a while before I picked back up my reading for pleasure, because I was really burned out. I also didn't watch many movies for the first year or so after I got out of academia. I was that burned out that I was just kind of sitting around watching whatever was on TV and not really doing much of anything like that for pleasure. It took me a little while to get over that. I was incredibly burned out. So yeah, how did I deal with it? It was just time, right? For me, it was really just a matter of time and giving myself the time to regain the energy and the interest to do it again. And once I did, then it came back with a vengeance, and now I'm much, much better, and I read, a lot for pleasure, and it's fine. So that was really just it, right? I had an extreme form of burnout from being in academia, and it just took me some time to sort of recover my pleasure and my enjoyment in reading and also in watching films, just for their own sake and not for the sake of, I have to write a paper about this next week or whatever, So, yeah, it was really just time. Question 5. Booktube is full of discussions of reading slumps, when dedicated readers seem to lose interest for a while in books. Sometimes they just can't find a book that appeals to them. Have you ever experienced a slump? If so, how did you handle it? If not, do you have any advice to give people who are experiencing slumps? I have been talking in the past couple of videos about how I just sort of recently, like, this sort of winter and spring, had kind of a slumpy period where I wasn't super interested in reading for a while. I think it's interesting the way that Booktube talks about these periods of our lives, because, I'm speaking as someone who I have multiple hobbies, right? I have lots of hobbies, and my interest in them tends to kind of come and go, right? So yeah, it's kind of natural for me sometimes to just have less interest in reading, because I'm getting really into a television show right now, and all I want to do is watch that TV show, and I don't really want to read much. And that's fine. I think it would be a problem if suddenly I lost all interest in everything and I wasn't doing anything at all, because to me that would suggest that there was something going on with my mental health that was negatively affecting my ability to have any kind of pleasure in anything. But there are definitely times when I'm just not as interested in reading because there's something else that I'm more interested in, and that's fine. That's totally fine. I generally I read every day. That is a habit that I've built up for myself. But there are definitely days when I'm just gonna read one chapter in a book, and then I'm gonna go and I'm gonna be doing other things, right? Because I just have other things to do, and that's perfectly fine. So yeah, I would say probably don't sweat it if you feel like you're in a slump. Though again, if it's a situation where you're maybe not getting pleasure from anything, then you might want to do a little self-examination and decide and determine if there's something maybe going on with your mental health that's causing a problem for you. But I don't have any issue with just, I'm less interested in reading right now because I'm playing a video game every day. I'm playing a really long video game that's really immersive and really involved, and I want to be playing that video game more than I want to be reading, so I'm going to be not reading quite as much because I'm busy with this other thing that's interesting me, and that's fine. I think that's perfectly normal and healthy. Prompt 6. Booktubers also talk about book hangovers, when readers are so moved by a book that they find it difficult to move on to a new book. Have you ever felt this way? Maybe? I can't really think of a specific book that did something like this to me. There are definitely books that I've found very moving and that I think about for a long time afterwards and that stick with me in my mind and my heart and my soul. But I don't know that I've ever experienced a situation where like a book has so like affected me that I can't even start another book. I usually I'm moving on to the next book pretty much immediately, even if a book has deeply affected me. I'll journal about it a little bit to talk about my feelings, to write out my feelings about the book that I've just read, but then I move on to the next book pretty much right away. And prompt number 7, tell us about a few books that almost always work for you. Something that might have remained a favorite throughout your life, despite any changing reading tastes. Something that always seems to hit just the right spot when you need a lift. Perhaps some lifetime book hangover where the text will always be at the back of your mind. I think there's several books that I could say would qualify for that. And the obvious one, the one that is sort of my go-to, and if you've watched any of my videos or been around here for any length of time, you will probably know when I say that The Lord of the Rings is kind of like my soul book, I guess you would say, right? This is the book that I think is probably most profoundly impacted both my reading tastes in terms of what I like to read, but also just like who I am as a person and my entire like moral compass and the way that I view the world. This is the book that probably has done the most for that, and this is a book that I can come back to at any time. I can pick it up at any point. I can read any part of it and it will work for me, right? It's that kind of book that is just, it's a part of, it's embedded itself in my mind and in my heart and my soul, and it's going to always be there, and that makes it a book that will always work for me, and it's worked for me since I was 15 years old when I first read it. So yeah, that's this one. There are several other books I think that I could say would be true, that would be true of. The Lord of the Rings is the one that's the most true, right? But Pride and Prejudice would be another one. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, which I just reread, is another one. A number of Shakespeare's plays, including Macbeth, including A Midsummer Night's Dream, are like that for me as well. But yeah, that's what I got. And then the final prompt is just to tag people. I am not in the habit of tagging specific people very often. I think a lot of people have done this tag over the past several months. So I'll just say, if you haven't done this tag and you want to, you should do it. I think it's a really interesting tag to think about, especially as someone, again, like I've been a reader since I was a kid, an avid reader, and so it is really interesting to sort of look back on my life as an adult and look at how my reading has shifted over the years and how it continues to shift over time. So yeah, that's what I got for today. Leave a like if you liked this, comment if you want to say something, discuss this topic, and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.